Yomi is Daf Lamed Ches Gittin 38, and we're going to start on the bottom of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. Now, the Gemara on the bottom of 37b is discussing the Mishnah, which talks about a slave who was captured and then he was redeemed by a different owner, a Canaanite slave, meaning he was owned by a Jew, but he was a Canaanite, so he has a quasi status as a Jew. And he was captured by the idolaters and then redeemed by another Jew, by a different Jew. So the Mishnah had said that if he was redeemed to be a slave, then he goes back to being a slave. And if he was redeemed to being free, then if he was redeemed to being free, then he's not going to be enslaved. Whereas Rashbag says, either way, he goes back to being enslaved. And the Gemara has a dispute between Abaye and Rava. At what point did the original owner give up hope of ever getting the slave back, in which case the slave would be declared ownerless, or did the owner never give up hope? At what point was the slave redeemed? Before the owner gave up hope or after the owner gave up hope? Abaye says it was after he gave up hope. Abaye says it was before he gave up hope, and Rava says it was after he gave up hope. So the Gemara says we're going to analyze Rava's position further on the bottom of 37b. Well, Rava da Amar Achar Yeush, according to Rabba, who says that he was freed after the original owner gave up hope, and who, when it says that he's enslaved, it means he goes enslaved back to the second owner, not the first owner. Well, Rabba Sheni to the second owner. Rabba Sheni Miman Kanile. Who did the second owner acquire this slave from? He acquired him, so the Gemara says, Mishavai, he acquired him from the captor, from the idolatrous captor. But the Gemara says, Shavai Gufe Mikanile. How did the idolatrous captor actually acquire this slave? The Gemara says, yes, that's an aspect of Jewish law, that the idolatrous slave, if he kidnaps him, he's acquired him. Kanile Lamaisa Yadav. He hasn't acquired his essence, his body, but he's acquired the value of his work, the value of his hands. And the difference is that if the slave would have, let's say, somehow been gifted something, that the idolatrous captor doesn't acquire it, but he has acquired the work product of his hands. The Rish Lakish says, how do we know? What's our source for this idea that an akum, idolater, can acquire another akum's work of his hands? What's the source for this? Because it says, so it says, the idolater says, also from amongst those who dwell amongst you, mehem tiknu, you shall acquire them. And the words mehem tiknu, Rashi says, are extra because it already says mehem tiknu eved v'yama. And then it says again, mehem tiknu. So it didn't need to say these words. So we learn from here, atem konim mehem, v'lohem konim mikem. We learn from here that you are able to acquire slaves from them. We're on the top of 38a, but they do not acquire one of your slaves. They do not acquire you. And they also do not acquire one from each other. And then the Brisa continues, I might think they may not acquire one from another. I might think they might not acquire one from another. So the Gemara interrupts and says, what do you mean? We just said they don't acquire one from another. So the Gemara says, no, this is what it means. They don't acquire the goof, the essence. I might think they also don't acquire the work of their hands. Amras kavachomer. So we say it's not true from a logical argument. An idolater can acquire a Jew's hands. If an idolater takes a Jew, Rahman al-Islam, as a slave, he acquires the work of his hands. Will call Shekain. For sure, he can acquire another idolater. And when it says, by the way, idolater acquires a Jew, it's referring to this Canaanite slave because the Canaanite slave has the status of a Jew. I might think the idolater can only acquire him by purchasing him, like happened with this idolatrous capture, with some sort of proprietary act. I might think he doesn't acquire him. Lo, Amar Papa, Ammon and Moab tiru b'Sichon. We learned from the case of Ammon and Moab, who were captured by Sichon, and Sichon thereby acquired them. And then, as a result of that, the Jews who had initially been prohibited against fighting Ammon and Moab, once they were captured by Sichon, then they were allowed to fight them. So we see from here that the idolater can acquire another idolater through a chazaka, through a proprietary act. Well, so the Gemara says, Ashkan Ovi Kochavim, Ovi Kochavim, Ovi Kochavim Yisrael Minon. Well, how do we know idolater can acquire another Jew through a proprietary act? Because that's our case where the idolatrous captor has captured the Canaanite slave who's considered a Jew or a quasi-Jew, because it says Vayesh Mimenu Shevi. It says in the verse that they took captives, that the Canaanite Melcharav took captives from the Jews. And so we see from here that from the fact that they were captive, that proves, since the Torah calls them captives, that proves that the idolater has acquired the Jews through chazaka. So Amar Shimon bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan, Evet shebarach mibeis ha'asurim. Let's say there's a slave who runs away from the prison, yatzol cheres. He automatically goes free. Once he runs away from his idolatrous captors who are imprisoning him, he automatically goes free. Below, not only that, El Shekofin, as Rabbi Yochanan says, we force his master, the Kosov will get you, or we force his master to write him a document of emancipation. And what's the reason? So that to say that he's allowed to marry a full-born Jew. So the Gemara says, Tanan Rashbag Omer Benkach Benkach Yishtabet. So our Mishnah, we're going to ask a question from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah has said that if the slave is captured and then he's redeemed by the second owner, he goes back and he's enslaved. Benkach Benkach Yishtabet. He goes back and he's enslaved. Whether or not he redeemed him in order to be freed from captivity. Amar Rabbi Bar Rachana, in the middle of 38a, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Malcham Shoshana Rashbag Mishnah Seinu. Halacha Kamoso, the halacha is always like Rashbag whenever he's in our Mishnah, except for three cases, the cases of Erev Sidam and Raya Achrona. Discuss those three cases elsewhere, but was the guarantor, then there's the case of the Sidon is the case of the get, which it was contingent upon an item, and then there's the Raya Achrona, the person who has a late proof from the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. Anyway, we see from here that this is not that. So we see from here, though, the halacha is like Rashbag in our case. In our case, says that he goes back and he no matter, even if you redeem him, he's going to be considered to be a slave. So for sure, if he runs away, he's a slave. So it's a question on Rabbi Yochanan, because in the first case, Rabbi Yochanan says a slave that runs away goes free. And our Mishnah is saying that he's enslaved. So how do we explain this Mishnah? So the Gemara says, well, Bishlam Abaye, we can understand that according to Abaye, we could say that our Mishnah is talking about a case before he gave up ownership, and where Rabbi Yochanan says he goes free is after the owner gave up hope of ever getting it back. Fine, that makes sense. El Rava says that our Mishnah is referring to the case where the owner has given up ownership, given up hope of getting the slave back, and still the halacha is like Rashbag that he goes back to the owner. Benkach yishtabed. So if that's the case, well, how would Rava explain it? So the Gemara says kasha. So kasha Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan is in a contradiction between Rabbi Yochanan's position. So the Gemara says no. Amacha Rava time of my. What's the reason why Rashbag says the halacha is that he becomes enslaved? He goes enslaved, no matter how he was redeemed. The Chizkiah, because of the logic of Chizkiah, because what does Chizkiah say? That if we're going to release him to his freedom, then every Canaanite is going to throw themselves to be enslaved by the idolaters. But that was the case of Chizkiah, but this case of Rabbi Yochanan is where a slave runs away. Borech Shani, that case of where a slave runs away is very different. If he runs away and he's caught, he's going to be killed. So you can't compare that to a person who throws himself to an idolatrous army and says, you guys take me. So we're saying it's a totally different case. One who gives himself over willingly to be enslaved, he is going to survive, whereas the person who runs away and he's putting his life at risk is not going to inspire too many people to follow him. Gemara is going to tell us several stories now. Am say Demar Shmuel Ishtabai. Shmuel's maidservant was captured. So Parkua Masa. So they redeemed her to be a slave. And they sent him Shalchule Anan. We're sending you back your slave, Karashbag Svirlan, because we hold like Rashbag, who says that no matter what you had in mind when you redeemed her, she goes back to being a slave. Shalchule Anan Karashbag Svirlan At. Tell us whether or not you hold like Rashbag. If you hold like Rashbag, then she's going to be your slave for sure. Inami karabanan svirlach, but if you hold like the Rabbanan and say that if you redeemed her to go free, she goes free. If you redeemed to be a slave, she goes back to her owner. If you hold like the Rabbanan, we redeemed her to be free, and so therefore we redeemed her to be a slave, and so therefore she's still enslaved. The Inu Savar, but they made a fundamental mistake. They thought it was Lufnei Yehoshava. They thought that Shmuel had not given up hope, and so therefore she goes back to being a slave. Veloi, it was La'achar Yehoshava. It was after Yehosh, and so therefore Shmuel, and it was after Yehosh, and it was like, and Bai said it was after Yehosh she goes free. Shmuel only by the Shtabude lo Mishtabed. Shmuel says. Not only, and Shmuel says, not only in that case, hold on one second, meaning to say that she had given up the Yehush. Rashi says it was after Yehush, and so therefore Rashi says she was Hefker. But they didn't realize that it was after Yehush. For Shmuel, not only did Shmuel not enslave her anymore, but rather, even Gittin the Cherusa Namilo Shmuel said she doesn't even need a document of emancipation; she's automatically free. And Shmuel Tamei, and Shmuel follows his logic. Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel is consistent, where he says, she doesn't even need a document of emancipation. If you free such a slave, she doesn't even need a document of emancipation. As it states, "V'kol avid ish miknas kasef." Because it states in the verse, who can eat from the carbon Pesach? Anybody who is a Kohavet Ish Miknas Kesef, anybody who's a male slave who has a circumcision. Evet Ish for Evet Isha, you mean only a man, but not a woman. Ela Evet Sheyesh Lo Rishus Rabo of Karai Evet. A slave whose master has dominion upon him is called a slave. Ein Lo Rishus Rabo of Ein Karai Evet. But if his master does not have dominion on him, he's not going to be called a slave. And so therefore we see that if his master is not ownership over him anymore, he doesn't even need a document of emancipation. Another story, Amsei de Rabbi Abba, the maidservant of Rabbi Abba, Barzutra Ishtabai, she was captured. Perka Hu Tarmuda Lishum Isisa. So there was an idolater, a Tarmudian, who redeemed her to be his wife. Shalchuela Didei. So they sent a message to him. Iyaus Avadata. So they sent him a message, and the message that they sent to him, they sent him the message was, if you want to act properly, send her a document of emancipation. Where says, what's the story? If they found people to redeem her, if they were able to redeem her, why does she need the document of emancipation? Let her be a slave. And he load matzu parkula, but if they had nobody to redeem her, then what are you doing by releasing her? My avi, what are you accomplishing? So the Gemara says, "Om the matzu parkula." So really, the idolater was willing to let her be redeemed. But they said, if you really want her to be redeemed, it's going to cost money. So send her the documents of emancipation. Everybody's going to get together. Oh, she's a free slave. She's a free Jew. Oh, then you'll be able to do a better fundraising appeal. Because people don't want to send money for a slave. They'll send money to redeem a free woman. Or alternatively, the idolater didn't want to release her. But once Abba Bar Zutra would send her a document of emancipation, he'd be embarrassed to say he's married to a Jew, and he'll release her. So Gemara says, but why? Idolaters even like to be with the Jewish animals more than their own wives. So for sure he's going to want to be with a Jewish woman. Gemara says, yeah, and that's only in private of Farhesia, but in public, it's embarrassing for them, and they're not going to want to be married to her. So if you release her, then he's going to, if you give her freedom, then he's going to release her. There was a maidservant, there was a maidservant in Pumpadisa, that people were acting with her freely, promiscuously. Amar Abaye, Yilabdi, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Kol Mashachar Abdu, Ovdi Rabasei, Ave Kaifina Le'Gamara. So Abaye said, we're not for the fact that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that if you free your slave, you're in violation of a positive commandment. I would free Ave Kaifina Le'Gamara. I would force them. I would force them to release her. I would force him to write a document of emancipation. Ravina said you should still do it. He said, in this manner, even Rav Yehuda would admit that you have to release her because there's a prohibition being done with her. Abaye says Mishum Isuro. Abaye Mishum Isuro. You mean to say that Abaye was saying that even though it's a prohibition, he's still saying you shouldn't release her? Amar Rav Chanina bar Rav Katina, Rav Yitzchak, Ma'isa ba'isha achas. But wasn't there once an incident with a woman shechatzi shifcha v'chatzi baskor, and she was half slave and half free, meaning she had originally two owners. One of them freed her and the other one didn't, so she's still a slave to one and she's free to the other. 38b at the top. The kafulas rabba v'asa baskor, and they forced her to be released. Forced her master and they released her. What's the reason? The reason is because they were acting with her in a disrespectful manner and promiscuous manner. So we see from here that you forced her to be released under those circumstances. So what Abaye should have said, that under these circumstances, that she should be forced to be released. So the Gemara says, the Gemara's answer is the two cases are not the same. Two cases are not the same. That woman was half slave for half free. She wasn't fit for she wasn't married to, she wasn't fit to be with a slave or free. She was in no man's land. But this case, this woman was a total slave. Abaye says there is a solution. Make her with a Eved Ivri, and then there'll be a good solution. Look at the Rash, the Rashi says that what does Rav Nachman say? What's the reason why they forced this woman who was half slave and half free to be freed? Not because she was commanded on the mitzvah of Pur Ravu, because remember the Gemara says this in Chagig at the very beginning, Tekantela. The Gemara says, what do you do with this person who's a half slave, half free? They say, you work for your master one day and one day you work for yourself. He says, Tekante Larabo, you fix his master. But what about himself? He has to do the mitzvah of having children. But this woman's not commanded in Puravu because women are not commanded in that mitzvah. But rather, the reason was because Rav Nachman said specifically because she wasn't designated for a specific man. They were for her hefker zanus. They were being promiscuous with her. The Gemara says, let's analyze this statement. Gufa Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Kol Mashachar Abdu Ovdi Rabasei. That Shmuel said whoever frees their slave is in violation of a positive commandment. As it says, Olam B'Hem Tavodu. You should always be enslaved, always enslave the Canaanites. So Meiser, what about the incident with Meiser Rebbe Lazar? Shenilchnas Beis HaKnesses. What about the incident with Rebbe Lazar? Comes into the synagogue. Sorry, didn't find the minion. V'Shechar Abdu, and he freed his slave. V'Shlimu Sarah, and that's how he had the minion. So we see that you're allowed to free your slave. So the Gemara says, in that case, it's a mitzvah, Shani. It's a mitzvah, is different. You're allowed to violate this Olam B'Hem Tavodu for the purpose of a mitzvah. It's problematic. The Gemara in Brachos says, but what about the fact that it's mitzvah baba say? It's a mitzvah that comes, mitzvah baba ver, it's a mitzvah that comes by violating a sin. So we can't say that that's a mitzvah. So there the Gemara gives a different answer. If it's a mitzvah of the public, it's different. And Rashi there explains that helping other people say Kaddish and respond to their prayers is Bamiras Kedusha, saying Dvarim of Kedusha is considered a mitzvah derav, is considered a great mitzvah. So the Gemara, the Rishonim also asked the question, how could this mitzvah of a minyan, which is a rabbinic mitzvah, override the biblical commandment of Olam B'Hem Tavodu? So we saw four answers in the Rishonim. The Ramban says, when it says that they have to be your slave, it means that you can't release them for nothing. But if they're going to be released to help you do a mitzvah, it's clearly not a violation of that commandment. The Rashba says no, that's not the case. But he says that even though it's a rabbinic mitzvah, if it's a mitzvah derab, if it's a communal mitzvah, it overrides a biblical mitzvah. Ramban gives another answer that praying in a community is so important, it overrides a positive commandment to the Torah. Because it says in the Gemara that when Hashem comes to the synagogue and he doesn't find them a minion, he immediately gets upset. And the Ran gives a different answer. The Ran says that the positive commandment to freeing a slave is not an actual positive commandment. And he says it's not an actual mitzvah saseh. It's just like an asmachta. Okay, so the Gemara says Tan Rabbana, and the rabbis taught in the Brayso, so tavodu, that they always have to worship you, the Canaanite slaves. So one position is that this is a reshus. That's the position of Rabbi Shmuel, meaning to say you're not obligated to do this. What Rashi explains here, because it says in Deuteronomy about the 7 nations that none of them shall live. So therefore, it needs to say, it's just to tell you that Lo Bem Tavodu is Rashi says Lahatir Echa Mishar Umos Abal Kananis Shemishiva Umos V'Oi Ben Shata Rashalak Nosa Be'Eved. It's telling us that you're allowed to acquire one as a slave, whereas Rabbi means as opposed to let's say killing them, that you're allowed to acquire them as a slave. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says Chover. Rabbi Akiva says it's obligatory. Mara says V'Dilma Rabbi Lazar several command Rishus. Maybe Rabbi Lazar when he freed him, he was posking like the one. Like Rabbi Shmuel, why do you have to say that Rabbi Elazar was freeing him only because it was a mitzvah? Maybe he was passing like Rabbi Shmuel that you're allowed to free them. Where it says, no, don't say that because we have another source where explicitly Rabbi Elazar says it's obligatory. There are 3 cases, 3 areas where the Balabatim, where the people lose their money. The one is the Mafki Avdayel Charusa, that they release their slaves and they violate the positive commandment. They look at their fields on Shabbos, they start counting their money on Shabbos. Or they make their meal on Shabbos like the Kiddush Club. The rabbi is giving the drasha, they go out and make their Kiddush Club. All these things cause people to lose their money. There were 2 families in Jerusalem. One of them made their meal on Shabbos during the rabbi's drasha, so they lost their money, and the other one made their meal on Erev Shabbos. Rashi says on Friday night, and so therefore it's not proper honor for Shabbos because we're supposed to make your meal. The major meal has to be during the day, not at night. And they were intending to make their meal on Friday afternoon, and thereby they were nullifying the big meal during the day. Alternatively, on Erev Shabbos, and so therefore they did it every day. They did it on Friday afternoon instead of making the big meal on Shabbos. Some people have this practice that they want to make Shabbos before Shabbos. They want to make their big meal prior to Shabbos. No, the meal has to be on Shabbos. Somebody who releases, somebody who consecrates their slave, he was makdish their avid, he goes to free. So what does this mean? So you say, my slave is hektish. Hektish typically means you consecrate something to the temple. That if you're makdish your slave, the slave goes free. What's the reasoning? Gufe lo kaddish, because you can't actually be Makadish's body. You're not going to bring his body as a sacrifice on the temple. So with Melo Kamer, and he didn't say I'm being Makdish his money. So therefore, what was his intent? He was saying let him be a holy nation, meaning to say I'm telling him he's Jewish. And so therefore he goes free. Rav Yosef says, I'm a Rav. Rav Yosef says in the name of Rav, Hamafkir Avda Yotzachar. It's not a Makdish. The one who declares his slave onerous goes free. Mandam or Makdish, the one who says if he makes him sacred, he goes free. For sure, if he makes him onerous. Mandam or Mafkir, the one who says if he makes him onerous of a Makdish law, but if he makes him sacred, he doesn't go free because Dilma would make him. Or maybe he's saying, I'm just giving the value of my slave to the temple. In a case where you're either Makdish your slave or you're Mafkir your slave, or you're declare him sacred or you declare him ownerless, does he require a document of emancipation or not? Tashma, let's come and learn from this. The Amar, Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rav Echad Zev Yechad Zev Yotzar Cheres. In most cases, they go free, Vitzarach get shecher, and they require a get of emancipation. Amar Rabba Umosvinen. So they were both cases. They require a get shecher. So in both cases, says Rav Chia bar Abba in the name of Rav Echad Zev Yechad Zev Yotzar Cheres. Vitzarach get shecher. Whether or not you're makdish or you are mafkir, he goes free and he requires to get shecher. Amar Rabba Masvina Nashmaitin. And we challenge his teaching, which was said in the name of Rav. Hamakdish nechasa. What about the fact that somebody consecrates his property? Vayu ba'en avadim, and there were slaves amongst them. The treasurer is not allowed to free the slaves. The treasurer is not allowed to free the slaves, not through a document of emancipation and not through money, meaning to say that the slave himself cannot release himself from hektish by taking money from other people, because the temple doesn't really own the goof, the body of the slave. He only owns his money. And so therefore the hektish can't free him. But what the treasurer could do is he could sell him to other people. They can release him. And Rebbe says, Omer Ani, Omer Ani, that's a phrase that's unique to Rebbe. Afu no saying the me'atzmo. He can give his own money because as though he was sold to the temple. Anyway, but we see from here explicitly that the Bryce says that if somebody is makdish his slave to the temple, it's for money and not for cherus. And so therefore, how can Rabbah say that he automatically goes free? So the Gemara says, Masnisa karamis alei de Rav. Rav Tanu Pag. Rabbah would say, you're challenging me from a Bryce on Rav. Rav can argue with that Bryce. Rav is the equivalent of a Bryce. So again, where Gemara is going to challenge this position of Rav, but we'll stop here. We'll stop here with the recording. God willing, pick this up at noon and also on Shabbos Kodesh.